Americans have a deep, psychological obsession with happy endings. Your historical textbooks are filled with perfectly framed conclusions, a passionate kiss in Times Square, a signature on the steel deck of a battleship, or a polite handshake in a quiet farmhouse. But as a German, a citizen of a nation that understands the absolute, clinical reality of total collapse and unconditional defeat, I must tell you a very uncomfortable truth. America has never truly known how to end a war. Today, we are conducting a forensic autopsy on 4 of America's largest conflicts. We are not looking through the sanitized, romanticized lens of Hollywood. We are examining these conclusions through the cold, mathematical eyes of the German perspective. The geopolitical realities of the American Civil War or the jungles of Vietnam are about to force you to reevaluate your entire understanding of victory. Let us begin with the American Civil War. In April 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending attrition that consumed over 620,000 American lives. American textbooks frame this moment as an act of profound, unparalleled generosity. Grant allowed the defeated Confederate officers to keep their sidearms, their horses, and their dignity. They were simply told to go home. From a German geopolitical standpoint, this was not generosity. It was political suicide. After the Second World War, Germany was subjected to a ruthless, systematic process of denazification. The Allies understood that an ideology must be surgically extracted from the population. Symbols were demolished, propaganda was criminalized, and the architects of the regime were hung at Nuremberg. Meanwhile, the United States allowed the architects of a violent rebellion to return to their estates with their pride intact. The federal government permitted the construction of towering bronze monuments to General Lee and allowed the defeated South to implement the Jim Crow laws, legally enforcing racial subjugation for another century. By failing to clinically excise the ideology of the Confederacy, the American Civil War did not actually end in 1865. It simply mutated into a low-level, sociological conflict that infected the nation for the next 150 years. From a forensic perspective, you cannot cure ideological rift by placing a polite bandage over it. We move forward to the Korean War. In July 1953, military commanders signed an armistice, halting the violence and freezing the border near the 38th parallel. Germans are uniquely sensitive to the trauma of a divided nation. We lived with the Berlin Wall for decades. But the American government officially classified the Korean kinetic attrition as a mere police action, treating the result as a strategic tie. The reality is that American General Douglas MacArthur suffered from a fatal dose of tactical hubris. He promised his men they would be home by Christmas, entirely dismissing intelligence reports until 300,000 Chinese soldiers poured across the Yalu River, forcing the longest retreat in U.S. military history. Signing an armistice is not achieving peace, it is simply pausing a timer on a bomb. Over 36,000 Americans and nearly 3 million Koreans and Chinese perished, only for the border to return to exactly where it started. 70 years later, 2 massive armies still glare at each other across the demilitarized zone, a strip of land saturated with active landmines. America created a divided nation identical to Cold War Germany. But while the Berlin Wall was physically dismantled, the Korean DMZ remains. The Korean War was never resolved, it was simply suspended by bureaucratic exhaustion. Next, we examine the conclusion of the Second World War in the Pacific. On September 2, 1945, General MacArthur accepted the Japanese surrender aboard the USS Missouri. Americans perpetually pat themselves on the back, claiming they single-handedly saved the world by forcing Tokyo to its knees. But let us look at the clinical mathematics of 1945. While the United States was dropping 2 artificial suns on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Red Army launched Operation August Storm. Over 1.5 million Soviet troops crashed into Manchuria, absolutely obliterating the Japanese Guandong Army in a matter of days. The Japanese High Command did not surrender purely because of American atomic science. They surrendered because they were terrified of facing the biological wrath of Joseph Stalin. Furthermore, the way America ended the war was a masterclass in pragmatic hypocrisy. They presented a clean, moral victory to the public. Behind closed doors, however, the United States immediately initiated Operation Paperclip, recruiting over 1,600 former Third Reich engineers, including Wernher von Braun, to build their rockets. In the Pacific, they granted absolute legal immunity to the architects of Japan's Unit 731, men who conducted unauthorized clinical trials on human subjects, in exchange for their clinical data. The war did not end with moral justice. It ended with the victor quietly collecting the most valuable brains of the defeated to prepare for the next global conflict. Finally, we confront the ultimate American psychological trauma, the Vietnam War. On April 30, 1975, Saigon fell, marked by desperate helicopters fleeing from the roof of the U.S. Embassy. This event created the greatest cognitive dissonance in modern American history. To this day, millions of Americans intensely debate. We did not lose militarily, we just withdrew. Or, we won every major battle but lost the war on the news broadcasts. To a German military analyst, a loss is a loss. The United States dropped over 7.5 million tons of explosives on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, more than double the amount dropped in all of World War II combined. They utilized chemical defoliants to strip the biology of the jungle. Yet, a military superpower spending billions of dollars was methodically bled out by agricultural workers wearing tire tread sandals, armed with an unbreakable psychological will to survive. The United States government tried to package this geopolitical catastrophe into a neat diplomatic box called the 1973 Paris Peace Accords, claiming they achieved peace with honor. But the chaotic, panicked evacuation of the embassy completely exposed the truth. You cannot use a B-52 bomber to neutralize a deep-seated belief. America did not lose to the Vietnamese at the negotiating table. They lost because they reached the absolute physical limits of what kinetic military force can achieve. In summary, the American military machine fights with overwhelming industrial firepower, but it consistently fails to comprehend the psychology and geopolitics required for the post-war era. A piece of paper signing a surrender does not magically erase the ideology of your enemy. My forensic question to you is this: out of these four conflicts, which American conclusion do you believe was the greatest historical deception? Did the United States truly never lose in Vietnam, or are Americans simply too strategically rigid to admit a clinical defeat? Leave your verdict in the comments below.